Hello and welcome to Enquire to Choir. My name is Eva and I'm here to help you, fellow choir people. Sopranos, altos, tenors, basses. You can Google and YouTube about them, you will find endless information. However, as you probably know, theory and practice are different things, especially when it comes to amateur choir singers. While of course it is very important to know the basics and the theory about choir voices. Throughout my career, it turned out that some things about voices stand out, repeat themselves, and have simple but strange solutions. In this video, we are going to talk about choir voices, sopranos, altos, tenors, and basses, and I will share my experience with voices characteristics. I emphasize the fact that this is my experience and it doesn't have to be yours. But who knows, maybe sometime in the future, some of the things mentioned here in the video turn out to be useful. So let's start with the video. When it comes to identifying the voice of the singer, there's already a video about it here on the channel. Here. I will make a playlist with videos that are connected with this topic, so you can check it out once you finish this video. But as you probably know, we differentiate voices when it comes to their range and when it comes to their timbre, their color. You also probably know that amateur choir singers are not professional singers, and they exemplify a different vocal behavior. To put it in simpler words, when I read that an average choir soprano sings from C4 to A5, I ask that book, where do those sopranos grow? It often comes down to these things. What the singers are able to sing already when they come to you, what they are capable or will become capable of singing after some practice, and what they think they're able to sing, which goes both ways because there are those who think they can sing everything, and then there are those who don't think they can sing anything, which are both very interesting philosophies, I must say. Sopranos. Not the television show, thank God. The average soprano range is in choirs, in amateur choirs, from C4 to F5. That F5 is something that you can work on. The biggest characteristic of a soprano is that their voices, they ring the most in the higher part of their range, but not the highest part of their range. Naturally, their voices just sound a lot better when they're higher. That's the biggest characteristic. How do you know if a person is a soprano or an alto? They don't have much resonance in the lowest part of the range. Their voices sound at D4 and at D5 are very different. They feel more comfortable in the higher range. So that's around the B4. But when you go further up to, for example, D5, that's where things start to get a bit more complicated. That particular part of the frequency spectrum is always the highest than the rest of the choir, and in my opinion has the most different timbre to the rest of the choir. It's like it's the furthest apart from the choir sound, and they always have to find their way how to blend better into the choir sound. It is also true, as people, when we listen to the choir sound, we always hear the sopranos best. That's just the way we are formed when it comes to our ears. Plus, we are used to hearing sopranos as the lead in the choir sound. I repeat, the comfortable range, it's just the place in their vocal range where you have no problems with the sound. However, when you go further up, then it can become an issue because those notes are rather high. You have to put in an extra effort to get the sound you want. How will you do that? Well, you have to take the time to practice these particular frequencies. So when you're warming up, you have to go to those notes in a logical way. And it is very true that while they're warming up, they can get to much higher notes than they're able while it is just a regular score. It is all about the context. So when they're warming up, you make them go to very high notes. My rule of thumb is the highest note they have to sing in all of the scores we're currently singing plus 2. So if I have a G, G5, I make them go to B5. What happens is you stretch that range a bit. The G5 is not the highest note they have already sung. They have already reached the B5, so G5 seems much simpler to sing after that. To sing above their comfortable range and to get to the highest notes, they need the power. So the vocal technique becomes much more important and you have to work on that. When somebody says to me, for example, she's not a strong soprano, I always ask myself, did they work on that or did they just define it? I always want to ask, are you working on that? Have you practiced it? Have you done some vocal drills for it? Because there are many vocal exercises, some of them are mentioned in one of the videos, that can work on that. From my experience, for the sopranos to get to the highest range they can, they need the power, the technique, of course, and somebody to tell them you can get to it. You just have to believe it. For example, we are currently singing How Deep Is Your Love by the lovely Bee Gees, and my choir sopranos have to reach the G5. So, me you need to show. That show in their scores is a G5. Usually, I don't take them higher than an F. So to reach the G in that line is a really difficult thing. And what do? They're scared of it. So they do, me you need to show. They get to it just like they sing everything else and then they think, oh my God, this is the highest note. And then they just go like they're tapping it. They're not singing it. They just reach it and leave that tone immediately, which affects the sound. And then I tell them, listen, don't be afraid of it. Go to it. You have to reach it. And if you run away from that note, you're just gonna make things worse. But if you go to it and you want to reach it and you aim to reach it, then it will become better. It's amazing how many times that sentence helped when it comes to reaching the higher notes. Just telling them, go for it, reach it, don't shy away from it, and go to it louder, because when you say go to it louder, they give more power. And once they are able to sing that particular note louder, then it is much easier to make them sing that note a bit less loud down the line. From my experience, because their identity as a choir vocal group is to mainly sing the melody, it turns out that if they find a particular melody more beautiful, they will take extra time to perform it better, which negatively affects the tempo. They emphasize the melody too much, and when it comes to the choir sound, that doesn't work because they're not singing a solo, they're singing as a group, as a voice group in a choir. I have to tell them, don't over sing it, because if they over sing it, they put the tempo in risk. They stop the sound a bit. They're not blended with the rest of the choir as they could be, because they're taking extra effort to emphasize the melody. And when they do that, the rest of the choir, it's not synchronized. But also, if they're in a higher range, their voices are ringing. They start to, have bigger resonance. And when you connect several notes that are ringing really powerfully, that could also spoil the tempo beat. So I have to tell them, Listen, just sing it as they were shorter or pronounce the lyrics a bit quicker to compensate for that fact. Because at all times we have to take care of the definition of a choir, and that means that the choir sound as a whole is the most important thing. Because they need more power to sing the higher notes, they tend to take more time to take a breath. They're less quick about it. So I found that to be a thing I have to synchronize my choir to. The way the sopranos take a breath and the altos take a breath is a very different thing. And the biggest challenge I find when it comes to the sopranos is making their singing polished, because they are the ones who, from that soloist perspective, they tend to not listen to the others. Again, just my experience. You don't have to agree with it. But it turns out that as a voice group, they're the least likely voice group to listen to others. So they tend to go on their own, and I have to take them down a bit and say, listen, the sound is really not blending with the others at that particular note. You have to take care of the harmony, or you have to take care of the beauty of the sound, the quality of the sound, because it sounds really different or really sharp, but not high sharp. I mean, as a something sharp, as an object. I have to talk a lot to my sopranos, work on this particular tone. You have to take it with more care. This particular tone, it's not just about reaching the height, it's about blending it with the rest of the choir. They're the most individual voice group in the choir, so I find that the most challenging part. And they're not easy when it comes to taking on a different kind of role. For example, in one of the songs, I made them sing the backup part, which is a huge shock for them. And I gave them that song on purpose. They're singing, just the accompaniment when it comes to the arrangement. And it's really difficult for them to get into that identity because they're used to sing and over sing. And in that particular score, they're just, having a rhythm. But it is a very useful practice. That way, I made them think more about the rest of the choir. The last thing, for them to have more power to sing some of the higher notes, it's very useful when they have a bigger space and when they're not sitting right next to each other, because if they are sitting in the middle of two people, they tend to feel more restricted and they're afraid of being too loud and they're struggling with the people next to them. If you make them sit apart, then they tend to put their voices much more upfront and it becomes more powerful because they're surrounded by empty space and not with other people. Altos. They're always in the middle. What makes a choir sound is harmony, and the alto part regularly has the crucial notes. They define if it is a major chord, a minor chord, most of the time. From my experience, they as a vocal group tend to just sing without putting extra effort to express something. Maybe because their vocal range is much more comfortable to sing. Mostly they don't have a certain part of their range where they feel uncomfortable. They mostly feel comfortable and then they don't feel like they have to put the extra effort. So to get expression from the altos is much harder than to get it from the sopranos. Sometimes they tend to be less active because the frequencies are lower, so they have to compensate for that. For them to sound as active as the sopranos, they need to compensate, if that makes sense. Their energy is just not as the soprano energy, it is different. And to connect them better, the altos have to sing with more agility, which is something I, as a choir director, have to work on. They don't feel as comfortable as the sopranos when it comes to singing the main melody, and to get an expressive main melody from them is something I really had to work on. But I will say that when you listen to a choir, we tend to react more instinctively to the soprano melody than to the alto melody. It's harder for us to recognize the main melody in alto part than in the soprano part, because the structure of choir sounds are mostly done with sopranos having the main melody. Which, to be honest, as an alto, I find to be rather unfair, but okay. Their breaths are easier to handle. They can take a quicker breath and take a lot of air. And the vocal technique when it comes to the alto range is much more evenly spread. So it's easier to handle the way they're taking a breath. But to get the same activity, the same agility, that is something I have to work on every time with every alto. They just have to give the extra energy to blend better in the choir sound. While when it comes to the sopranos, I have to take that energy down a bit for them to blend better with the choir sound. They're different. Ironically, from my experience, the altos tend to sing the higher notes much more easily because they don't have a lot of them. They just go to them and sing them without much stress. I think it's because they don't have the psychological barrier. It's not like, oh my god, now I have a higher note. It's like, I'm already here, I might as well get to the highest note. In general, while the sopranos tend to be very loud, altos are quieter. They lack volume, so the balance between the sopranos and altos is very important. And shout out to all of my fellow altos out there. Tenors. I tend to think that they have it the toughest. When it comes to amateur choirs, tenors are both hardest to find and hardest to work with them because I don't know, in my choir culture, they're the hardest voice to find. That doesn't have to be the case in your choir culture. So when you get a tenor, it's mostly a person who is a rock and roll singer and had a band and is used to, I don't know, Guns N' Roses and Freddie Mercury. So it's when it comes to the vocal technique, I find them to be the hardest ones to work with because they're so used to using their throats only. And the biggest irony about that is when they do it their way, they sound better than when they do it my way, which I learned to just let go. I don't have to be right all of the time because the most important thing is that the sound is good and the sound is blended. If that means that I have to compensate like that to not have the perfect vocal technique, but I have a better sound, then I do that compromise. They have the toughest because their range is always covered by other people, altos and basses, more loudly and in a darker timbre. And it's just tougher for them to be recognized, to be registered in the choir sound. They can sing the loudest higher notes. They can sing the best they can. They can sing an amazing, I don't know, E4. But for them to sing a great E4, it takes a lot of effort, it takes a lot of power, it takes a lot of strength and bravery, honestly. But at the same time, the altos are singing around that range. They're much more comfortable in that range, so they tend to cover the tenors. However, they're very quick, they're very movable, they're very active. They have a lot of agility, which is amazing, and they affect the tempo the best. I find that if they go for it, the rest will follow more than the sopranos because the tenors tend to lead in the middle of the choir. So if you need someone to pull the tempo a bit, then the tenors will do it. To be honest, in every choir, the tenors, true tenors, are very hard to find. And I will admit this, they probably get a special treatment because we're just happy that they're there and we can work with them. And I want them to give their best. And the tenor singers in a choir tend to be the solo singers. As a group, they're not blended as well as other voice groups. That's just my experience. I will repeat that throughout the video 100 times. And finally, the basses. A very simple fact of life is that they're singing in the lowest register, the lowest frequencies. We as people, when we listen to the frequency spectrum, the lowest frequencies, we don't hear that well. Our ears need to put an extra effort in to be able to recognize the lower frequencies. Also, the lower frequencies mean longer wavelengths. So it takes a while for the tone of a lower frequency to happen. It takes longer for the particles to vibrate, and then it takes longer for that sound to come to you, the choir director, or to the audience. What that means is, from their perspective, when they're singing and when you're hearing them for their position, they sound in tempo and everything is clear. But when their sound reaches the choir director, it sounds like they're out of tempo, they're slowing down, or that they are not pronouncing the lyrics good enough. The biggest advice when it comes to the basses, if they have a certain rhythm, a certain pattern, a certain quicker part, and you find them to be slower than everybody else and pulling the tempo down, I don't think they're slower. I think they need to compensate for the fact they're singing the lower frequencies, the lowest when it comes to all of the other voices in the choir. So if I'm in that position, I tell them articulate better and over articulate, because when you over articulate, you don't have the biggest phonation. It doesn't have the time to ring, as when you do have a slightly lesser articulation, then you have more time to sing the vowels. But when that kind of a sound, a computer sound, more computer sound, comes to the choir director, then it sounds in tempo and articulated, because we are compensating for the fact that there are several of them singing very low frequencies with many words. Again, choir sound and the solo sound is a very different thing. We have to compensate and balance everything out. Sometimes it means overcompensating, but that's the way of life, you know? We have to compromise. It takes more time for the basses to develop a sound, and once they develop the sound, they take longer to leave the sound, to leave a certain note. If they have reached a really deep, low note, it takes time to reach it, to sing it, and to leave it. And for that, we have to compensate. Also, this will be a very strange tip, but for some reason it works. When they have an extra low note, the lowest they have to go, which they find to be really hard, tell them to do this. They open their mouths all the way, and then they pull their chin a bit to the neck. A bit. So like this. Not this. It's a slight movement. That helps. If this is the throat and this is your oral cavity, and they're singing really low and they have opened the mouth, when you do this a bit, the specter of the lowest sound is better positioned to go outside of the mouth. So it just works. For a single really low note, they have to reach. That's the biggest, weirdest tip I can give you, but it works. And actually, I will be honest, 4 years ago, when I came to the audition for a choir director of a choir, which I'm working with still, I won that audition when it turned out that that advice helped them. And that was around 10 minutes in. And later they told me that that's a tip they never got, and it turned out to solve a problem for them for a particular note. So it works. After talking about every individual voice part, I will say every combination of voices, every number of people in a choir, voice group in a choir, it can sound beautifully. But in my opinion, we have to compensate for some of the facts mentioned in this video. They have, as a voice group, different identities, different ranges, different problems, and when you put them all together, they have to compensate for a lot of things. But also, they take on a role that is more comfortable for them. So, what sopranos are lacking, altos have. What altos are lacking, sopranos have. And every voice in the choir can help you. The biggest point of this video is things are not always as they seem, and your directions for their sound can sometimes be really strange when you think about them, but it turns out that they work. Okay, so I mentioned I will do a playlist. Here's the playlist. I hope you watch the videos out there. Some of the videos are older. The algorithm of YouTube is not picking them up, but I think they're very valuable. Although I have to say the production is really low and I was really young, I was just starting out, so stick with me. I hope you find this video helpful. If you wish to see more from Enquire to Choir, you can watch all of the other videos here. You can like the video, you can subscribe, and if you have any questions, you can always email me or put it down in the comments section. Thank you for watching. Conduct well, conductors, and I'll see you next time. Bye!